Maxwell Carter had everything, except the woman he thought he loved. The night he discovered the betrayal, something inside him shattered. But instead of running away, he made a decision that would shock everyone. He would still marry into that family. Just not with the bride they were expecting, and the woman he chose, the one everyone had always ignored. The invisible sister, the one no one ever noticed, until he noticed her. And when he did, he decided she would be his. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the Super Thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. Maxwell Carter never imagined that the night that should have been the celebration of his dreams would turn into the worst nightmare of his life. The Whitmore mansion glowed under the golden lights of crystal chandeliers, and the sound of laughter echoed through halls filled with guests. It was the engagement party, his and Samantha Whitmore's, the woman he believed was the love of his life. He held a champagne flute, watching Samantha from across the room. She looked stunning that night, wrapped in a navy blue silk dress that hugged every curve of her body like a second skin. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her bare shoulders, and her green eyes sparkled under the soft light. She laughed, tilting her head seductively as she chatted with a group of friends. Maxwell felt his chest swell with pride. That woman would be his wife in less than a month. But something about that night felt off. Maxwell noticed the way Samantha glanced at her phone every few minutes, the way her fingers drummed nervously against the side of her glass. She seemed distracted, restless. When she excused herself and slipped through the side door leading to the back garden, Maxwell felt a tightness in his chest. Something was wrong. He followed her. The cool night air touched his face as he walked through the dark corridors of the mansion toward the garden. The sound of his breathing was the only noise he heard, aside from the distant murmur of the party inside. Maxwell walked slowly, guided by an intuition he couldn't ignore. That's when he heard her voice. Low whispering coming from behind the rose bushes surrounding the gazebo illuminated by moonlight. I know. But it's just one more month, Samantha said, her voice heavy with impatience. After I marry him, we'll have access to everything. The ranch, the properties, the businesses, everything. Maxwell stopped. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Do you really think he'll never find out? A man's voice, deep and familiar, responded. Maxwell recognized it immediately. It was Derek Hale, his former business partner, the man he considered a friend. Samantha laughed, a cold sound, devoid of any tenderness. Maxwell, please. He's as predictable as the sunset. He adores me, Derek. He'd do anything for me. And once we're married, he won't even notice how things are going to start changing. I'll put him exactly where I want him. Maxwell felt the world collapse around him. Her words were like sharp blades cutting deep into his soul. He clenched his fist so hard that his nails dug into his palms. The bitter taste of betrayal burned in his throat. And after? Derek asked, his voice heavy with desire. Maxwell heard footsteps approaching, and then Samantha's voice became lower, more intimate. After, you and I will finally have what we've always wanted. Freedom, money, and each other. Maxwell closed his eyes. Every word was a blow. He wanted to scream, wanted to walk into that garden and confront them, expose the charade in front of everyone. But something inside him, pride perhaps, or pain too deep to be exposed, stopped him. He backed away slowly, retreating in silence. His steps were heavy as he walked back to the mansion, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't return to the party. Instead, he went straight to the upstairs study, locked the door, and poured a generous shot of whiskey into a crystal glass. The amber liquid burned as it went down his throat, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness he felt in his chest. Maxwell looked out the window, watching the party lights below. All those smiling faces, all those warm congratulations. And no one knew. No one had any idea that the perfect bride was a lie. He sat in the leather armchair, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the rage, the humiliation, the searing pain of having been used as a stepping stone in someone's ladder of ambition. But then, slowly, something changed inside him. The pain began to transform. Maxwell raised his face, and his eyes, once filled with anguish, now gleamed with cold, calculated determination. He wouldn't be the victim in this story. He wouldn't let Samantha destroy him, but he also wouldn't cause a public scandal. He wouldn't give her or Derek the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. No, he would do something much better. Maxwell stood up, straightened his jacket and walked to the window. Below, he saw Samantha returning to the ballroom, the perfect smile back on her face, as if nothing had happened. Beside her, almost invisible in her sister's shadow, was Reese Whitmore. Reese was everything Samantha wasn't. While Samantha commanded attention with her dazzling beauty and aggressive confidence, Reese was discreet, almost shy. She wore a simple ivory dress, her brown hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her brown eyes were large and expressive, but rarely met anyone else's. She always seemed to be trying to disappear, as if her presence were a nuisance. Maxwell had never paid much attention to Reese. She was just Samantha's younger sister, a background figure at family gatherings. But that night, as he watched her from afar, something clicked in his mind. A slow, calculated smile curved his lips. If Samantha wanted to use marriage as a tool, then Maxwell would too. But he would change the rules of the game. He wouldn't cancel the wedding. He wouldn't run away. He would marry into the Whitmore family, yes, just not to Samantha. Maxwell took the last sip of whiskey, placed the glass on the table, and left the study with firm steps. His decision was made. And when he revealed his plan, the shock would be devastating. Because Maxwell Carter was no longer the naive man who walked into that party. He was a man who had just discovered that love can be the greatest weakness. And revenge, the sweetest strategy. 3 days had passed since the engagement party, 3 days of deafening silence from Maxwell Carter. Samantha tried to contact him countless times, messages, calls, even a visit to the ranch that was politely blocked by the staff. She was starting to get nervous, but still maintained that confident smile, as if nothing could shake her control over the situation. What she didn't know was that Maxwell was preparing something that would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon when Maxwell showed up at the Whitmore mansion without warning. His black Aston Martin stopped at the gravel entrance, and he stepped out of the car with calculated movements, wearing a charcoal grey suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and impeccable posture. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but there was something about the way he walked, confident, almost predatory, that made anyone notice something was different. The maid led him to the living room, where the Whitmore family was gathered. Richard Whitmore, the grey-haired patriarch with a rigid posture, sat in his favourite leather armchair reading the newspaper. Eleanor Whitmore, elegant and cold as always, embroidered a silk handkerchief while sipping tea. Samantha was beside her mother, flipping through a bridal magazine, her green eyes sparkling with excitement, thinking about the wedding preparations. And then there was Reese. She sat in the corner of the room, almost hidden behind a bookshelf, with a novel open in her lap. Her simple lavender cotton dress contrasted with Samantha's exaggerated glamour. She didn't even look up when Maxwell entered, as if she was already used to being invisible. "Maxwell!" Samantha jumped from the sofa, her face lighting up with a radiant smile. She ran to him, arms extended for a hug, but Maxwell took a step back, keeping his distance. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled. "All of you." Samantha's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, darling, please sit down." Maxwell didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping over each family member. Richard lowered his newspaper, frowning. Eleanor stopped embroidering, her posture becoming more rigid. Even Reese looked up from her book, her brown eyes meeting Maxwell's for a brief moment before looking away. "I came here to make an announcement," Maxwell began, his voice echoing through the silent room. "About the wedding," Samantha let out a nervous giggle. "Maxwell, if it's about the floral arrangements, I already said that I'm not going to marry you, Samantha." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor dropped her teacup, which shattered on the marble floor. Richard stood up abruptly, the newspaper falling from his hands. Samantha froze, her face paling as if she'd been slapped. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Maxwell removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes as cold as ice. "You heard me perfectly. But why? What did I do?" Samantha took a step forward, tears already beginning to form in her eyes. She had always been good at staging emotions. Maxwell smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know exactly what you did, Samantha. But don't worry, I'm not going to cause a scandal. I'm not going to cancel the wedding." Richard frowned. "But you just said—" "I said I'm not going to marry Samantha," Maxwell interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "But I'm still going to marry someone from this family." Everyone in the room looked confused, except Maxwell, who slowly turned and pointed to the corner of the room. "I'm going to marry her." All eyes turned to Reese. The young woman felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her book slipped from her hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. She looked around, hoping someone would say it was a joke, that Maxwell was delusional, that this couldn't be happening. "Reese?" Eleanor practically screamed, her voice full of disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Maxwell replied, without taking his eyes off Reese. He walked toward her, his steps slow and measured. Reese shrank in her chair, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Maxwell stopped in front of her and extended his hand. "Stand up." Reese hesitated, her eyes searching for some explanation in his face. But all she saw was that relentless coldness, that unwavering determination. With trembling legs, she placed her hand in his and stood up. Their hands touched, and Reese felt an electric shock run through her arm. His skin was warm, firm, and the way his fingers wrapped around hers, with a mixture of strength and something softer, almost possessive, made her heart race. Maxwell gently pulled her to the center of the room beside him, as if presenting a business partner. Reese could feel everyone's gaze burning into her skin. "This is ridiculous!" Samantha exploded, her voice shrill and filled with rage. "Reese, you want to marry Reese? She's nobody. She has nothing to offer." Maxwell turned to Samantha, and the contempt in his gaze was enough to make her step back. "She has something you never had, Samantha. Honesty." Richard stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Maxwell, this is insane. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," Maxwell cut him off, his voice cold and final. "And I will. The wedding will happen on the scheduled date, at the hired church, with all the guests who have already been invited. The only change is the bride." He looked at Reese, who was still in shock, eyes wide and breathing irregular. "Do you accept?" Reese opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at her family, at her father's red face filled with rage, at her mother's horrified expression, at Samantha's murderous look. And then she looked at Maxwell, this man she barely knew, who had always been just Samantha's fiancé, someone distant and unattainable. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Maxwell moved closer, his eyes penetrating hers with an intensity that left her breathless. He raised his hand and, with surprising gentleness, brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen over her face. The touch was brief, but enough to make Reese's skin tingle. "Because I need a wife," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "And you need a way out." Reese felt tears burn in her eyes. He was right. She had always been Samantha's shadow, always forgotten, always invisible. And now, suddenly, someone was seeing her, even if it was only out of revenge, even if it was only out of necessity. "Yes," she whispered, the words coming out before she could think. "I accept." Chaos erupted in the room. Samantha screamed, Eleanor fainted on the sofa, Richard began cursing. But Maxwell didn't move. He just looked at Reese, and for the first time since he entered that house, his smile seemed almost real. "Perfect," he said, gently squeezing her hand. "We're getting married next week." And with that, he led her out of the room, leaving behind a family in ruins and a completely uncertain future. But as Reese walked beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand still holding hers, a single question echoed in her mind. What have I just done? The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur. Reese barely had time to process what had happened. Suddenly she was being dragged to dress fittings, meetings with the wedding planner, last-minute adjustments. Everything that had been planned for Samantha was now hers, The French lace dress, the imported white flowers, the 5-tier cake. But none of it felt real. Reese felt like an intruder in her own life. Samantha had disappeared. No one knew where she had gone, and frankly, no one seemed to care. Eleanor barely looked at Reese, treating her with the same coldness as always, as if her younger daughter were just another item on a to-do list. Richard kept his distance, his pride too wounded to accept what had happened. And Maxwell. Maxwell was a mystery. Since that shocking Sunday, he had only appeared twice. Once to sign the marriage documents, and once for a brief meeting with the priest. He was polite, courteous, but distant. There were no stolen kisses, passionate declarations, or even a meaningful conversation. It was as if they were two strangers about to sign a business contract. And maybe that's exactly what it was. On the morning of the wedding, Reese woke up with a knot in her stomach. She looked at the dress hanging on the closet door, a masterpiece of silk and lace, with an elegant neckline and a long train that seemed to float like a cloud. It was any woman's dream dress, but it wasn't her dream. Eleanor entered the room without knocking, followed by two assistants who immediately began preparing Reese. Makeup, hair, jewelry, everything was done in mechanical silence. Eleanor supervised every detail with critical eyes, adjusting a curl here, a pearl there. But she didn't say a single affectionate word. There was no "you look beautiful" or "I'm proud of you." When Reese finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back was elegant, sophisticated, almost ethereal. But beneath all that beauty, she still felt like the forgotten sister. The church was packed. Hundreds of guests filled the polished wooden pews, all dressed in their finest clothes, all whispering about the scandal that had shaken high society. The bride swap was the topic of the moment, gossip spreading like wildfire, speculation running wild. But when Reese entered through the church doors, everyone fell silent. She walked alone down the aisle. Richard had refused to walk her to the altar, claiming he didn't support this circus. So Reese went alone, her steps slow and measured, her heart beating like a war drum. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, on Maxwell, who waited at the altar with impeccable posture. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his dark hair combed back, his jaw strong and defined. When their eyes met, Reese felt something strange. Not love, not passion, but something more complex. Respect, perhaps, or mutual recognition that they were both trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. When she finally reached the altar, Maxwell extended his hand. Reese hesitated for a second before placing her hand in his. The touch was firm, warm, and for a brief moment, she felt a flash of something she couldn't name. The ceremony was quick and efficient. The priest spoke about love, commitment, and partnership, but the words seemed to echo in a void. Reese repeated the vows mechanically, her voice low but clear. Maxwell did the same, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were engraving every detail of that moment in his memory. And then came the time for the kiss. Maxwell took a step forward, his eyes briefly dropping to her lips. Reese held her breath, her heart racing. He leaned in, and for a second she thought he would just press his lips to hers in a cold, ceremonial way. But that's not what happened. When his lips touched hers, it was soft, almost reverent. It wasn't a passionate or desperate kiss. It was something more subtle, more intimate. He gently held her face with one hand, his thumb caressing her cheek, while his lips moved against hers with surprising tenderness. Reese felt her entire body react. A wave of heat rushed down her spine. Her legs went weak and she had to lean on him to keep from collapsing. When he finally pulled away, their eyes met again. And this time there was something different there. A spark, perhaps, or a silent promise. The guests applauded, but Reese barely heard them. All she could feel was the burning on her lips and the deafening sound of her own heart. The reception was a whirlwind of smiling faces and empty congratulations. Reese smiled and waved, danced when they expected her to dance, cut the cake when it was time to cut the cake. But everything felt distant, as if she were watching her own life from the outside. Maxwell remained by her side the entire time, fulfilling his role as newlywed husband to perfection. He held her hand, placed his arm around her waist for photos, even whispered a few kind words in her ear when he noticed she was tense. But there was an invisible barrier between them, a wall of ice that neither seemed willing to break down. When the reception finally ended, Maxwell led her to the car. The driver took them in silence along the dark road to the Carter Ranch, now Reese's home too. The mansion was imposing, rising against the night sky like a stone castle. The lights from the windows cast a golden glow over the perfectly manicured gardens. It was beautiful but also intimidating. Maxwell helped her out of the car, his hand firm at the small of her back, a touch that felt both formal and strangely intimate at the same time. Reese felt her skin tingle under the dress, the heat of his palm penetrating through the silk. He led her through the mansion's silent corridors. Each step echoed on the cold marble, and Reese felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing on her shoulders. Finally, Maxwell stopped in front of a dark wooden door. "This is your room," he said, his voice low and controlled. Reese blinked, confused. "My room?" Maxwell nodded, pushing the door open. Inside was a spacious and elegantly decorated room, a canopy bed, antique furniture, a large window overlooking the fields. It was beautiful, but it was empty, impersonal. "And yours?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell pointed to the end of the corridor, on the other side of the house. The silence that followed was heavy. Reese looked at him, searching for some explanation in his eyes, but he had already turned away. "Good night, Reese," he said, starting to walk away. "Maxwell," she called out, her voice coming out stronger than expected. He stopped and looked back. "Thank you. For today." He studied her for a long moment, something passing through his eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps just exhaustion. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Good night." And then he disappeared down the corridor, leaving Reese alone at the door of a room that didn't feel like hers, in a house that didn't feel like a home, married to a man who was a complete stranger. She entered the room and closed the door, leaning against it. The tears finally came, silent and hot, streaming down her face. They weren't tears of sadness exactly. They were tears of confusion, of fear, of uncertainty about what would come next. Because Reese Whitmore, no, Reese Carter now, had just married a man who didn't even want to share the same hallway with her, and she had no idea how to survive what lay ahead. The first weeks at the Carter estate were the loneliest of Reese's life. Maxwell left early every morning to take care of the ranch business, and only returned late at night, when she was already locked in her room. They had breakfast at different times, dined separately, and when they occasionally crossed paths in the hallways, he would just nod politely before disappearing. It was like living with a ghost. But Reese was no longer the invisible girl who accepted everything in silence. Something had changed inside her the moment she said yes in that living room, a small flame of courage that was now beginning to grow. If Maxwell didn't want to talk to her, fine. She didn't need him to start living. Reese began exploring the property. The Carter Ranch was vast, acres of rolling fields, stables with purebred horses, gardens that looked like something out of a fairy tale. And the staff, unlike Maxwell, were warm and welcoming. Martha, the grey-haired housekeeper with a gentle smile, was the first to approach her. "Mrs. Carter," she said one morning, finding Reese wandering through the kitchen. "May I prepare something special for you?" Reese smiled shyly. "Please, just call me Reese. And you don't need to worry, Martha. I can make something myself." Martha looked surprised but pleased. "A woman who likes to cook. How wonderful. The kitchen is all yours, dear." From that day on, Reese began preparing her own meals, chatting with Martha about recipes, about life on the ranch, about everything and nothing. It was comforting to have someone to talk to, even though Maxwell remained absent. It was Thomas, the old gardener with calloused hands and kind eyes, who introduced her to the gardens. "You have a way with plants," he commented one day, watching Reese kneeling in the dirt, replanting rose bushes with an almost reverent delicacy. Her fingers were dirty with soil, but there was a gleam in her eyes that Thomas hadn't seen on that property in years. "I've always loved gardens," Reese confessed, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "But I never had space to have one." "Well, now you have all the space in the world," Thomas said with a warm smile. "This garden is yours." Reese felt her heart warm. For the first time since arriving there, she felt like she belonged somewhere. It was on a golden late spring afternoon that Maxwell saw her for the first time. Really saw her. He was returning from the stables, tired after a long day supervising the purchase of new horses, when he heard the sound of laughter. It was a light sound, genuine, musical. He stopped, intrigued, and followed the sound to the gardens. And then he saw her. Reese was on her knees among the flower beds, wearing a simple light yellow cotton dress that swayed gently in the breeze. Her brown hair was loose, falling in natural waves over her shoulders, some strands stuck to her sweaty face. Her hands were completely dirty with soil, and she was laughing, really laughing, at something Thomas had said. Maxwell froze. She was radiant. There was no other word. The afternoon sun illuminated her face, creating a golden halo around her, and when she smiled, her eyes sparkled in a way he had never seen before. There were no masks, no fear, no timid hesitation that had always marked their interactions. There, in that garden, with dirty hands and an illuminated face, Reese was completely free. Something inside Maxwell stirred. A strange sensation, almost painful, as if something frozen inside him was slowly beginning to melt. Thomas was the first to notice him. "Mr. Carter, we didn't see you arrive." Reese turned quickly, her eyes widening when she saw him. The smile disappeared from her face, replaced by that cautious expression she always wore around him. Maxwell hated it, hated that she closed herself off like that when she saw him. "Martha said you were here," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "May I steal a few minutes of your time?" Reese nodded, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Maxwell to a stone bench under a pergola covered with purple wisteria. The scent of the flowers was sweet and intoxicating. They sat down, and silence settled between them. Not comfortable, but not completely hostile either. "Are you well?" Maxwell finally asked, and there was something genuine in his voice that caught her off guard. "Yes," Reese responded, surprised by her own firmness. "I'm better than I imagined I would be." Maxwell nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know this isn't what you wanted, this marriage, me." Reese looked at him, really looked for the first time since the wedding. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability hidden behind that facade of control. He wasn't just the cold, calculating man she thought he was. There was pain there, too, and loneliness. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Is this what you wanted?" Maxwell turned to her, and their gazes met. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. It was just the two of them sitting under the wisteria, with the sweet scent of flowers enveloping them like a promise. "No," he admitted, his voice low, "but sometimes life gives us what we need, not what we want." Before Reese could respond, a strong breeze passed, knocking wisteria petals down on them. A petal landed delicately in her hair, caught between the brown strands. Without thinking, Maxwell reached out and carefully removed it. His fingers brushed against her hair, silky, scented with something floral and fresh. He held the petal between his fingers for a moment, and then, almost unconsciously, his eyes dropped to her face. Reese was looking at him, lips parted, breathing a little faster. Her brown eyes were deep, expressive, and Maxwell found himself wanting to know what she was thinking, what she was feeling. He brushed away a loose strand of hair that fell over her face, his fingers lingering longer than necessary on the curve of her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, and he felt a tingling at his fingertips. They stayed like that, suspended in time, looking at each other, so close they could feel each other's warmth, their breath mingling in the perfumed air. "Maxwell," Reese whispered, her voice trembling. He blinked as if waking from a trance and immediately pulled back. "I'm sorry," he said, standing up quickly. "I have work to do." And before Reese could say anything, he was already walking back to the house, leaving her alone under the pergola. Her heart beating irregularly, her skin still burning where he had touched her. Reese brought her hand to her face, touching the place where his fingers had been. Something had changed in that moment, something subtle but undeniable. Maxwell Carter had looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since arriving there, Reese felt that maybe, just maybe, she was no longer invisible. After that encounter in the garden, something changed between Maxwell and Reese. It wasn't something declared or obvious. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the changing of seasons. But it was there, vibrating in the air whenever they crossed paths. Maxwell started appearing more. Not explicitly, but Rhys noticed his presence more frequently. During dinner, he sometimes sat at the table instead of eating in his office. On Sunday mornings, he walked through the gardens while she tended to the flowers. And sometimes late at night she saw him watching her from the office window while she read on the veranda. They didn't talk much, but the looks said everything. It was on a cloudy morning that everything intensified. Rhys had woken up early, restless, and decided to visit the stables. She had always liked horses, but never had the chance to really ride. Martha had told her there was a gentle mare named Luna who would be perfect for beginners. When she arrived at the stables, the morning was cool, and the smell of hay and leather filled the air. The horses whinnied softly in their stalls, and Rhys walked slowly, observing each one with admiration. That's when she saw Luna, a grey mare with gentle eyes and a mane that shone like silver. Rhys extended her hand through the bars, and Luna approached cautiously. "Hi, beautiful," Rhys whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "You're even more beautiful up close." "She's skittish with strangers." Rhys turned abruptly. Maxwell stood at the stable entrance, leaning against the wooden wall with his arms crossed. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong tanned forearms. His hair was slightly messy, as if he had run his hands through it several times. There was something different about him that morning, something more relaxed, more accessible. "She doesn't seem skittish with me," Rhys replied, turning her attention back to Luna, who was now gently licking her palm. Maxwell walked toward her, his steps slow and measured. Rhys felt her heart race when he stopped beside her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, the woody scent of his cologne mixed with something more earthy, more masculine. "You have a gift," he said, watching the way Luna moved closer and closer to Rhys, confident. "Most people try to force trust. You just wait." Rhys looked at him, and their eyes met. There was something different in his gaze, an intensity that left her breathless. "Trust can't be forced," she said softly. "It can only be earned, with patience, with respect." Maxwell held her gaze for a long moment, and Rhys had the impression he wasn't just talking about horses anymore. "Do you want to ride?" he asked, his voice lower, almost hoarse. I've never really ridden," Rhys admitted, feeling her cheeks flush. "I don't know if it would be safe. I can teach you." Before Rhys could respond, Maxwell was already opening Luna's stall door and putting a saddle on the mare with expert, confident movements. Rhys watched, fascinated. There was something hypnotizing about the way he moved, the controlled strength of his hands, the concentration on his face. When Luna was ready, Maxwell led her out of the stable, and Rhys followed. The air was cool, and the sky was covered with low clouds that promised rain. "Come on," Maxwell said, holding the reins while waiting for Rhys to approach. She hesitated, looking at the height of the saddle. "How do I—" Maxwell moved closer, standing behind her. Rhys felt her entire body go on alert when he placed his hands on her waist, firm, warm, possessive in a way that made her forget how to breathe. "Put your foot in the stirrup," he instructed, his voice close to her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "I'll help you." Rhys obeyed, and before she could think too much about it, Maxwell lifted her with impressive ease. For a brief moment, she was suspended in the air, completely dependent on his strength, and then she was sitting in the saddle, her heart beating erratically. Maxwell adjusted her feet in the stirrups, his hands lingering longer than necessary on her ankles, then slowly moving up the side of her legs to adjust her position. Every touch was electric, even through the cotton skirt she wore. "Hold the reins like this," he said, covering her hands with his, showing her the correct movement. His fingers were long, strong, and completely enveloped hers. Rhys felt her skin tingle under his touch. "Maxwell," she whispered, not knowing exactly what she wanted to say. He looked up, and their faces were so close she could see the small golden flecks in his blue eyes, could feel his warm breath against her skin. "Ready?" he asked, his voice husky. Rhys just nodded, unable to form words. Maxwell mounted his own horse, an impressive black stallion, and led them along a trail that crossed the fields. They rode in silence for a while, side by side, the sound of hooves against the earth the only music. Rhys was nervous at first, but Luna was gentle and patient, and gradually she began to relax. The wind touched her face, her hair flew loose behind her, and she felt a freedom she had never experienced before. Maxwell watched her from the corner of his eye, a small smile touching his lips. There was something liberating about the way she laughed, how her eyes sparkled with pure joy. "You're doing well," he said, and there was genuine pride in his voice. Rhys smiled at him, a real smile, radiant, and Maxwell felt something tighten in his chest. They stopped near a stream, where the horses drank water. Maxwell dismounted first, and then approached Rhys, extending his arms. "Come." Rhys placed her hands on his shoulders, and Maxwell held her by the waist again. But this time, when he lowered her from the saddle, he did it slowly, so slowly that she slid down his body, feeling every firm muscle under his shirt, feeling the heat emanating from him like a flame. When her feet finally touched the ground, they were dangerously close. Maxwell's arms were still around her waist, and Rhys's hands still rested on his shoulders. They looked at each other, both breathing rapidly, hearts beating in sync. "Rhys," Maxwell whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips. She felt the world disappear around her. All that existed was him, the warmth of his body, the strength of his arms, the intensity of his gaze. Maxwell leaned in so slowly it seemed like an eternity. Rhys closed her eyes, anticipating the touch of his lips, the taste of him, the sensation of finally being kissed by him again. But then thunder echoed across the sky. Both looked up. The clouds had darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. "We have to go back," Maxwell said, but his voice was tense, frustrated. They mounted quickly and galloped back, but the rain came faster than expected. Within minutes, both were completely soaked. When they reached the stables, they were breathless, wet and laughing, a nervous laugh, loaded with unresolved tension. Maxwell ran his hand through his wet hair, pushing it back from his face. Rhys watched the drops of water running down his neck, disappearing under the collar of his shirt that now clung to his body, revealing every line, every muscle. "You should go take a hot shower," Maxwell said, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "I don't want you to get sick." Rhys nodded, but neither of them moved. The air between them was charged, dense with everything that wasn't said, everything that almost happened. Finally, Maxwell took a step back. "Good afternoon, Rhys." And he turned and walked away, leaving Rhys trembling, not from the cold, but from the desire that still burned beneath her skin. The storm that had begun that afternoon continued through the night, bringing with it not just rain but also ghosts from the past. Rhys was in the library, wrapped in a soft blanket, reading by lamplight, when she heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. She frowned. Maxwell wasn't expecting visitors, and it was almost 9 at night. Martha appeared at the door, her expression tense. "Mrs. Carter, there's someone here to see Mr. Maxwell." "Who?" Rhys asked, but she already knew by the way Martha hesitated. "Miss Samantha Whitmore." The name fell like a stone in the silence of the library. Rhys felt her stomach tighten, but forced herself to maintain her composure. "Where's Maxwell?" "In the office, ma'am. He asked me to bring you there." Rhys stood up, smoothing the dark green wool dress she wore. She took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she had cultivated over the past weeks, and followed Martha down the hallway. When she reached the office door, she could hear voices, Maxwell's deep and controlled, and another voice she knew very well. That voice that always diminished her, always made her feel small. Rhys pushed the door open and entered. Samantha stood in the center of the office, and Rhys had to admit her sister knew how to make an entrance. She wore a blood-red dress that hugged every curve of her body like a second skin, generous neckline, high slit revealing long legs. Her blonde hair fell in perfect curls, and her red lips gleamed under the light. She was clearly dressed to seduce. Maxwell was behind his desk, hands resting on the mahogany surface, jaw clenched. When he saw Rhys enter, something in his expression changed, became softer, more protective. "Rhys," he said, his voice filled with relief. Samantha turned, and when her green eyes met Rhys's, there was a cruel gleam in them. "Ah, little sister finally shows up. I hope you don't mind that I came to visit my fiancée. Ex-fiancée, Maxwell corrected coldly. And she's my wife. You have no place here anymore, Samantha. Samantha laughed, that high-pitched false sound Reese knew so well. Wife? Please, Maxwell. We both know this is just pathetic revenge. You're using my little sister to hurt me. She walked slowly toward Maxwell, each step calculated, each movement an attempt at seduction. But we had something real, Maxwell, something that can't be erased by a fake marriage. Maxwell didn't move when she approached, but Reese saw the way his fists clenched, how his jaw tightened even more. You were never real with me, Maxwell said, his voice low but sharp as glass. Everything you said, everything you did, it was all part of a plan to use my money, my position. You never loved me. And you think she loves you? Samantha laughed again, gesturing dismissively at Reese. Look at her, Maxwell. She's plain, dull, always been the family shadow. She has nothing to offer. I could give you everything. Beauty, connections, a true partner at your level. Every word was like a blow. Reese felt the familiar pain, that old wound that had never completely healed. She had always been the plain sister, the invisible one, the one with nothing special. And hearing this from Samantha in front of Maxwell brought all those insecurities to the surface. But then something happened that changed everything. Maxwell came out from behind the desk and walked to Reese. He passed Samantha as if she didn't exist, his eyes fixed only on his wife. When he reached Reese's side, he took her hand, not casually but firmly, possessively, protectively. You're wrong, Maxwell said, turning to face Samantha. His voice was calm, but there was an unwavering strength in it. Reese has something you never had, and never will. She has kindness, authenticity, the courage to be who she is, even when people like you tried to erase her all her life. Reese looked at him, shocked. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Maxwell squeezed her hand and continued. She doesn't need games, doesn't need masks. And yes, she's my wife. The only person who belongs in this place, in this house by my side. You're nothing but an unwelcome visitor. Samantha's face turned red with rage. You're going to regret this, Maxwell Carter. When she disappoints you, when you realize you made a mistake, leave. The word was said with such authority that even Reese was startled. Maxwell took a step forward, placing himself between Samantha and Reese like a shield. Get out of my house, he repeated, his voice ice-cold. And don't come back. If you try to contact me or my wife again, I'll take legal action. Do you understand me? Samantha looked between the two, desperation beginning to replace arrogance. She took one last step toward Maxwell, extending her hand as if to touch him. Maxwell, please. But it was Reese who spoke. She took a step forward, coming out from Maxwell's shadow, and faced her sister for the first time in her life with true firmness. He asked you to leave, Samantha. Samantha turned to her, surprised. What did you say? Reese took another step, her voice gaining strength. You heard me. My whole life you made me feel small. You humiliated me, ignored me, treated me like I was invisible. But I'm not that girl anymore. The words now came out like a torrent, years of pain and frustration finally finding voice. You're right about one thing. I don't have your superficial beauty, your ability to manipulate, but I have something you never had. Integrity. And Maxwell sees that. He sees me. And you can't stand it because for the first time in your life I have something you wanted, and you can't take it from me. The silence that followed was absolute. Samantha looked at Reese as if seeing her for the first time, mouth open, speechless. And then, without saying anything more, she turned and left the office, her high heels echoing through the hallway until the front door slammed. Reese stood there, trembling, barely believing what she had just done. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief, of liberation. Maxwell turned to her, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Pride, admiration, and something deeper, more intense. Reese, he whispered, taking a step toward her. And then, without thinking, without restraining himself, Maxwell pulled her into his arms. The embrace was firm, enveloping, as if he wanted to protect her from everything and everyone. Reese felt her face pressed against his chest, hearing the strong, rapid sound of his heart. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel his warmth, his strength, the security she never knew she needed. "You were incredible," Maxwell murmured against her hair, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are incredible." Reese looked up, their faces now inches apart. His eyes were intense, vulnerable, full of something that made her feel dizzy. Maxwell raised his hand and held her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the strength of his embrace. His thumb caressed her cheek, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I see you, Reese," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've always seen you from the first moment." And then he squeezed her hand. Not like before, not casually or ceremonially. This time it was a squeeze full of promise, of connection, of something they were both beginning to recognize, but didn't yet dare to name. Reese didn't let go. She held his hand with strength and tenderness, and for the first time since they married, they remained there and together, connected, no longer as strangers but as something more, something that was just beginning to bloom. After that night, something fundamental changed between Maxwell and Reese. The wall of ice he had built around himself began to crack, and through the hole she could see the man he really was, not the cold, calculating tycoon, but someone hurt, lonely, afraid to trust again. Maxwell started seeking her out. Not obviously, but she noticed he appeared in the library when she was reading, sat down for dinner when she was at the table, walked through the gardens when she tended to the flowers. And gradually, the conversations began. First they were superficial topics, the weather, the ranch, the horses. But then Maxwell began to share more. He talked about how he took over the family business at 22 when his father died suddenly, how he had to grow up too fast, carry burdens too heavy, how loneliness became his constant companion. And Reese listened. She didn't judge, didn't offer empty advice. She just listened, and in her presence, Maxwell discovered he could let his guard down. It was on a rainy afternoon that everything changed for good. Maxwell was in his office, surrounded by papers and contracts, trying to solve a complex problem with one of the ranch suppliers. His head was throbbing, frustration growing by the minute. He had spent hours trying to find a solution, but nothing seemed to work. That's when the door opened, and Reese entered without knocking. Maxwell looked up, surprised. "Reese, Martha said you've been here since 5 in the morning without eating anything," she interrupted, placing a tray with sandwiches and fresh coffee on the desk. "That's not healthy." Maxwell looked at the tray, then at her. There was something so domestic, so genuinely concerned about her gesture, that he felt something tighten in his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. But Reese didn't leave. Instead, she looked at the papers scattered across the desk, her forehead wrinkled in concentration. "What's going on?" Maxwell sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Supplier problems. They want to raise prices by 40%. But if I accept, I'll have to cut costs in other areas, which means laying off employees. And if I don't accept, they'll break the contract, and I'll be without supply for months." Reese bit her lip, thoughtful. And then, to Maxwell's surprise, she pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "Can I see the numbers?" Maxwell hesitated only a second before pushing the documents toward her. Reese studied them in silence for several minutes, her eyes scanning each line, each figure. "What if you diversified?" she finally said, pointing to one of the documents. "Instead of depending on a single supplier, you could work with several smaller ones. Split the risk. And look here," she pointed to another paper. "You're paying for their transportation. If you negotiate with local suppliers, you can cut that cost completely." Maxwell looked at the documents, then at her, eyes wide. That could work. "And there's more," Reese continued, now with more confidence. "If you create partnerships with smaller farms in the region, you not only solve your problem, but also help the community. It's good for business and for the ranch's image." Maxwell was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had said. And then slowly a genuine smile, the first she had seen on him, lit up his face. "You're brilliant," he said, and there was pure admiration in his voice. "How did you think of that?" Reese blushed, looking away. I used to help my father with the household finances when he was alive." I always liked numbers, solving problems, but Samantha always said it was a waste of time, that I should focus on being more feminine. Maxwell felt anger rise hearing this. How many times had Samantha, and probably the rest of the family, erased Reese's talents, made her feel less than she was? Samantha was wrong, he said, his voice firm. About everything. About you. Reese looked at him and their gazes met. There was something different in Maxwell's eyes now. Not just admiration, but something deeper, more vulnerable. Reese, he began, his voice becoming lower, more intimate. I need to tell you something. She waited, her heart beating hard. Maxwell stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets, posture tense. When I chose you to be my wife, it was out of anger, out of revenge. I wanted to hurt Samantha the way she hurt me. And you were just a piece in that game. The words hurt, but Reese already knew this. She remained silent, waiting. Maxwell turned to her, and there was pain in his eyes. But at some point, I don't know exactly when, you stopped being a piece on the board. You became real, and I... He hesitated, as if the next words cost him everything. I don't know what I feel anymore. But I know I don't want this distance between us anymore. Reese stood slowly, her heart beating so hard she could barely breathe. Maxwell. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. The proximity was overwhelming, electrifying. You scare me, he admitted, his voice hoarse. Because when I'm near you, I'm no longer the cold, controlled man I need to be. You make me feel vulnerable. And I don't know how to deal with that. Reese raised her hand, and with a courage she didn't know she possessed, touched his face. Her fingers traced the strong line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble, the warm skin under her touch. Vulnerability isn't weakness, she whispered. It's courage. It's trusting enough to lower your defenses. Maxwell closed his eyes at her touch, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever received. And then, in a move that caught her completely off guard, he knelt before her. Reese held her breath. Maxwell Carter, the proud, powerful man who never bowed before anyone, was on his knees in front of her. He took her hands, holding them as if they were fragile and precious. When he raised his eyes to her, Reese saw tears there, not tears of weakness, but of liberation. "Help me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this alone. I don't know how to stop being afraid. I don't know how to love again without protecting myself. But I want to try. With you." Reese felt her own tears falling. She knelt before him, getting on the same level, their faces now inches apart. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We do this together. No games, no masks, just us." Maxwell held her face with both hands, his thumbs caressing her tear-wet cheeks. His eyes traveled over every detail of her face, the brown eyes full of compassion, the pink lips parted, the expression of pure tenderness. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered, "and I don't deserve you." "It's not about deserving," Reese replied, covering his hands with hers. "It's about choosing. Every day choosing to be here, choosing to try." Maxwell pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes, breathing deeply. They stayed like that, kneeling on the office floor, holding each other as if they were the only real thing in a world of uncertainties. And in that moment, Maxwell Carter's pride finally fell. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, and through the cracks, light began to enter. Light that had the name Reese. "Stay with me," he whispered against her lips, so close she could feel his warm breath. "Not just as my wife on paper. Stay with me for real." "I'm here," Reese replied, her hands squeezing his. "I've always been here." And there, in that silent office, with rain drumming against the windows, two wounded hearts began to heal together. 2 weeks had passed since that afternoon in the office, 2 weeks in which Maxwell and Reese walked side by side, discovering each other in small and meaningful ways. Shared dinners, conversations that extended into the night, looks that lasted longer than they should. But there was still a physical distance between them, an invisible line that neither dared to cross, as if they were afraid that Once crossed, there would be no going back. Until that Saturday afternoon, Maxwell had suggested a horseback ride to the most remote part of the property, where there was a small wooden cabin that served as shelter for the workers during planting seasons. Reese accepted enthusiastically, and they left when the sun was still high in the sky. The ride was peaceful, filled with light conversation and genuine laughter. Reese had become a confident rider, and Maxwell loved watching her. The way her hair flew in the wind, how her eyes sparkled with pure joy, how she laughed without reservation. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't notice the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The first thunder caught them by surprise. "We need to go back," Maxwell said. But when he looked at the sky, he realized it was too late. The storm would arrive before they could return to the main house. "The cabin!" Reese shouted over the sound of the wind that was beginning to blow hard. They galloped toward the small wooden structure, arriving seconds before the rain poured down. Maxwell helped Reese dismount quickly, and both ran inside, pulling the horses into the small attached shelter. When they finally closed the cabin door, both were completely soaked. Reese started to laugh, a nervous laugh full of adrenaline. Her blue cotton dress clung to her body, revealing every curve, and her wet hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders. Drops of water ran down her face, her neck, disappearing under the neckline of the dress. Maxwell watched her, unable to look away. She was stunning, wild, free, completely natural. "We're soaked," Reese said, still laughing, trying to wring the water from her dress. "There's firewood over there," Maxwell said, his voice huskier than intended. "I'll light the fireplace." The cabin was simple but functional, a small space with a stone fireplace, some wooden chairs, old blankets stored in a chest. Maxwell worked quickly, stacking wood and lighting the fire. Within minutes, flames crackled, casting a golden, dancing light on the wooden walls. The warmth began to fill the space, but it wasn't enough to chase away the shivers running through Reese's body. Her lips were slightly blue, and she was trembling. Maxwell grabbed one of the blankets from the chest and approached her. "You need to take off that wet dress," he said, and there was something in his voice, concern mixed with something more intense, more dangerous. Reese looked at him, eyes wide. There's nothing for me to wear." Maxwell removed his own shirt, also soaked, revealing a strong, defined torso, muscles sculpted by years of physical work. The tanned skin gleamed in the firelight, and Reese felt her mouth go dry. He extended the shirt to her. "Wear this. It's big, but at least it's relatively dry." Reese took the shirt, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was electric. She turned her back and, with trembling hands, began to unbutton the wet dress. Maxwell knew he should turn away, give her privacy, but he couldn't. He watched the curve of her back being revealed, the pale skin contrasting with the dark, wet fabric, the delicate shape of her shoulders. When Reese finally put on his shirt, enormous, reaching mid-thigh, and turned around, Maxwell forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful. The shirt revealed her slender legs, wet hair falling over bare shoulders, eyes huge and bright in the firelight. "Come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Close to the fire. Reese approached and Maxwell wrapped the blanket around both of them, pulling her close. They sat in front of the fireplace, so close they could feel each other's warmth, bodies touching from shoulder to hip. Silence settled in, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, dense, full of everything that hadn't been said, all the desire that had been contained. "Why did you protect me?" Reese finally whispered, turning to look at him. "That night with Samantha, why did you do that?" Maxwell looked at her, and in the firelight, his eyes seemed liquid, vulnerable. "Because you saved me from myself," he replied, his voice low and intense. He raised his hand and touched her face, fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her tremble, but not from cold. "When I saw you for the first time, really saw you, it was like waking up from a nightmare. You were real, genuine, and I was so lost in the darkness I created around myself that I didn't realize I was drowning." Reese turned completely toward him, their knees touching. "Maxwell." He pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. Both their breathing was fast, ragged. "You make me want to be a better man," he whispered. You make me want to believe I can still feel something besides anger and pain. Then feel, Rhys whispered back, her hands rising to hold his face. Feel this. Feel us. And then Maxwell kissed her. It wasn't like the quick, ceremonial kiss at the church. This was different, deep, desperate, full of months of contained desire and repressed emotions. His lips moved against hers with a hunger that left her dizzy, and when his tongue asked for entrance, she opened to him without hesitation. The kiss deepened, intensified. Maxwell's hands traveled down her neck over her shoulders, landing on the curve of her waist and pulling her closer. Rhys moaned softly against his lips, and the sound nearly undid him. He gently laid her down on the blanket in front of the fire, his body covering hers, but without pressing down on her, giving her space to breathe, to feel. His lips left hers and traced a path across her face, along her jawline, down her neck in soft kisses that made her arch against him. "Maxwell," she whispered, her hands exploring his bare chest, feeling every muscle, every accelerated beat of his heart. He captured her lips again, his hands slowly beginning to unbutton the shirt she wore. His fingers trembled, not from nervousness, but from pure emotion, from reverence for the moment. When the shirt finally opened, revealing her soft, warmed skin in the golden firelight, Maxwell stopped for a moment, just looking at her. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and there was so much feeling in his voice that Rhys felt tears burn her eyes. She pulled him down again, their bodies finally meeting without barriers. Skin against skin was a revelation, warm, electric, perfect. Every touch was exploration, every kiss was promise. Maxwell touched her as if she were precious, fragile yet strong at the same time. His hands explored every curve with torturous slowness, memorizing every sigh, every shudder. When they finally joined, it was with a tenderness that contrasted with the intensity of their desire. Their eyes met, and in that moment everything else disappeared. The rain outside, the painful past, the uncertainties of the future. There was only them, Maxwell and Rhys, two hearts finally finding their way to each other. They moved together in a rhythm both ancient and new, their bodies learning each other's language. And when climax came, it was like a wave that swept them together, leaving them trembling and entwined. Afterward they remained like that, bodies intertwined, breaths synchronized, the fire crackling softly beside them. Maxwell pulled the blanket over them and held Rhys against his chest, fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. "Never again," he whispered against her hair, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Never again will I let you feel invisible." Rhys looked up, her eyes meeting his, and there in the firelight, with the storm roaring outside and warmth enveloping them, she finally understood. She was no longer the forgotten sister. She was loved. Rhys woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the cabin. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a clear sky and the smell of wet earth. The fire in the fireplace had reduced to weak embers, but she was still warm, warm in Maxwell's arms. She turned carefully, not wanting to wake him, and just watched him. In the morning light, he looked different, younger, more vulnerable. The tension lines that normally marked his face were softened by sleep. His dark hair was messy, falling over his forehead, and his lips, those lips that had kissed her so passionately the night before, were slightly parted. Rhys felt her chest tighten with an emotion so intense it almost hurt. She loved him. Maybe she always had, since that day he showed up at the Whitmore house and chose her. Not for who she pretended to be, but for who she was. Carefully she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. The touch was gentle, reverent. Maxwell opened his eyes. For a brief moment, just a second, she saw something there. Tenderness, contentment, maybe even love. But then, like a curtain falling, his expression changed. The coldness returned, the defenses rose again. He pulled away abruptly, sitting up and running his hands over his face. "We need to go back." His voice was different, distant, as if the previous night had never happened. Rhys felt a chill run through her body, not from the temperature but from the way he was pulling away from her, both physically and emotionally. "Maxwell," "Get dressed," he interrupted her, already standing and looking for his clothes, which were now dry. "We're going to be late for breakfast." He didn't look at her, not once. Reese dressed in silence, her hands trembling as she buttoned her dress. His shirt, the one she had worn during the night, which still carried his scent, was folded carefully over a chair. She picked it up, wanting to return it, but Maxwell was already leaving the cabin. The ride back was silent and tense. Maxwell kept his eyes fixed ahead, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid. Reese tried to talk a few times, but he responded with monosyllables or simply didn't respond. It was as if she had become invisible again. When they reached the mansion, Maxwell dismounted quickly and handed his horse's reins to one of the staff. "I have work to do," he said, still without looking at her. "I'll be in the office." And then he simply walked away. Reese stood there, holding Luna's reins, watching him disappear inside the house. The pain in her chest was almost physical, an open wound that bled with each beat of her heart. Martha appeared on the veranda, with a worried expression. "Mrs. Carter, is everything all right?" Reese forced a smile. "Yes, Martha, just, tired." But everything wasn't all right, and they both knew it. The days that followed were torturous. Maxwell returned to his old pattern, leaving early, coming back late, avoiding any contact with Reese. They didn't dine together, didn't talk, barely crossed paths in the hallways, and when they did, he would just nod politely before walking away, as if she were a stranger. As if the night in the cabin had never happened. Reese tried to understand. She tried to be patient, give him space. Maybe he needed time to process what had happened, to deal with his own emotions. But with each passing day, the pain grew, transforming into something more: anger. Anger at herself for giving herself so completely. Anger at him for making her feel again that she wasn't enough. Anger for allowing someone to have so much power over her heart. It was on a rainy afternoon, exactly 1 week after that night, that Reese finally had enough. She marched down the hallway to his office and opened the door without knocking. Maxwell was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by papers as always. He looked up, surprised by the sudden entrance. "Reese, I'm busy." She cut him off, her voice cold and firm. "You're always busy, Maxwell. Too busy for dinner. Too busy to talk. Too busy to look at me." Maxwell stood up, his expression cautious. "I have responsibilities." "No," Reese interrupted him again, taking a step toward him. Her eyes gleamed, not with tears, but with fierce determination. "Don't give me excuses. I deserve more than that. I deserve the truth." Maxwell looked away, jaw clenched. "Reese, look at me," she demanded, her voice breaking slightly but still firm. "At least give me that. Look me in the eyes and tell me what happened. Why are you doing this?" Maxwell finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes almost broke her. It wasn't coldness. It was fear. Pure, raw fear. "Because I don't know how to do this," he finally admitted, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to let someone in without destroying myself in the process." "So you destroy me instead?" Reese asked, tears finally escaping. "You make me feel loved, seen, important, and then you treat me like I don't exist?" Maxwell ran his hands over his face, frustration and pain evident in every movement. "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Reese laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "From what?" "From me," Maxwell exploded, his voice echoing through the office. "From me, Reese. Don't you understand? I destroy everything I touch. Samantha taught me that. My father died too early because the stress of caring for me in this place killed him. I bring pain to people who get close to me." "That's ridiculous," Reese said, taking another step toward him. "You're not responsible for your father's death. And Samantha, she used you, yes, but that doesn't define who you are." "It doesn't matter," Maxwell said, turning his back to her. I can't allow myself to feel this for you. It's too dangerous." Reese felt something break inside her. It wasn't her heart. Her heart was already broken. It was her patience, her willingness to accept crumbs of affection from a man who was so afraid he'd rather hurt her than risk being hurt. "You're right," she said, her voice now eerily calm. "It is dangerous. Loving someone is always dangerous because when you love, you become vulnerable. You give that person the power to hurt you." She walked around the desk and stood before him, forcing him to look at her. "But you know what's even more dangerous, Maxwell. Living in so much fear of being hurt that you never really live. Building walls so high around yourself that you end up suffocating alone inside them." Maxwell looked at her, and she saw the struggle happening in his eyes. Desire against fear, love against self-preservation. "I'm not a shadow," Reese continued, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'm not that invisible girl anymore who accepts anything just to be noticed. I became someone here in this place, and I won't allow you, or anyone else, to make me feel small again." She took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she had. "So you need to decide, Maxwell. You can keep living behind those walls, alone and safe but empty, or you can take a risk. You can let me in for real, without running away every time things get too intense." She took a step back, creating distance between them. "But I won't beg. I won't wait forever. And I won't accept being treated like I don't matter. Because I do matter, and I deserve someone who isn't afraid to love me." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Maxwell looked at her, eyes wide, breathing irregular. She could see the emotions taking turns on his face: fear, desire, pain, love. But he said nothing. And in that silence, Reese found her answer. She nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her face. "When you're ready to stop running," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "you know where to find me." And then she turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Maxwell alone with his fears, his walls, and the terrible realization that he had just let the best thing that ever happened to him walk out the door. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the office. 3 days in which Maxwell lived in the hell he had created for himself. Reese didn't avoid him. She simply lived her life as if he didn't exist. She continued tending the gardens, talking with the staff, riding Luna every morning. But when their paths crossed, she greeted him politely and moved on, as if he were just another employee of the house. And it was killing him. Maxwell barely slept. Every night he tossed and turned in bed, remembering the feeling of having her in his arms, the sound of her laughter, the way she looked at him as if he were something precious. And every morning, he woke up with the crushing weight of realizing he had thrown it all away because of fear. It was Martha who finally confronted him. She entered his office one grey morning, placed a cup of coffee on the desk, and looked at him with that maternal expression that always made him feel like a boy again. "Mr. Carter," she said, crossing her arms, "with all due respect, you're being an idiot." Maxwell looked up, surprised. Martha rarely spoke to him like that. "Martha, that young woman out there," Martha continued, pointing to the window where Reese could be seen tending the rose bushes, "is the best thing that ever happened to you. And you're throwing it away because you're afraid." "You don't understand," Maxwell began, but Martha interrupted him. "I understand perfectly. You were hurt. That Samantha used you and discarded you. But Mrs. Reese is not Samantha. She never was. And if you don't open your eyes soon, you're going to lose her for real." Martha turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Your father," she said softly, "would be ashamed to see you waste the chance to be happy. He always said love is worth any risk." And then she left, leaving Maxwell alone with his thoughts. Maxwell looked out the window, watching Reese. She wore a simple white cotton dress, and the wind made her hair dance around her face. There was a serenity in her now, a quiet strength that wasn't there before. She had grown. She had become the strong, independent woman she always had the potential to be, and he had almost destroyed her again with his fears. No more. Maxwell stood up, determination hardening his face. But before going to Reese, there was something he needed to do, a cycle that needed to be closed once and for all. Samantha was living in a small apartment downtown, very different from the luxurious life she was used to. When she opened the door and saw Maxwell, her eyes lit up with hope. "Maxwell, I knew you would come." "I came to close a cycle," Maxwell interrupted her, his voice cold but not cruel. "Nothing more." Samantha's smile faltered. Come in." Maxwell entered, but remained standing, not wanting to stay longer than necessary. Samantha sat on the sofa, her hands nervously smoothing her skirt. "I made a mistake," she began, tears already forming in her eyes. "I know I did. But Maxwell, we can—" "No," Maxwell said firmly. "There is no we, Samantha. There never was. You saw me as a means to an end, and I was foolish enough not to realize it." Samantha wiped her tears, the mask beginning to fall. "And Rhys? Do you really think she's better than me? She's plain, dull—" "She's everything you never were," Maxwell interrupted her, his voice gaining an intensity that silenced her. "She's honest. She's kind. She's strong in a way you would never understand. And I almost lost her because I was still trapped in the pain you caused." He took a step toward her, his eyes piercing. "But not anymore. You have no power over me anymore, Samantha. That chapter of my life is closed, and I never want to hear you talk about my wife that way again." Samantha looked at him, shocked, and for the first time Maxwell saw something beyond calculation in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that she had lost something valuable through her own greed. "Goodbye, Samantha," Maxwell said, turning toward the door. "Do you love her?" Samantha asked, her voice small. Maxwell stopped, turned slightly. "More than you could ever understand." And then he left, leaving the past behind once and for all. When Maxwell returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He found Rhys exactly where he expected, in the garden, hands dirty with soil, tending the last flowers of the day. She heard him approach but didn't turn around. She continued working as if he weren't there. "Rhys," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "if you came to apologize again only to run away afterward, please don't waste your time," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't come to apologize," Maxwell said, taking another step toward her. "I came to tell you that you were right." That made Rhys stop. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes cautious. Maxwell approached until he was standing directly in front of her. "You were right about everything. I was living in so much fear of being hurt again that I ended up hurting the only person who really matters. You." He took her hands, dirty with soil and all, and held them as if they were the most precious things in the world. "I went to see Samantha today," he continued, and saw Rhys's eyes widen, not to get back with her, but to close that chapter once and for all, to tell her, and myself, that she has no power over me anymore. Tears began to form in Rhys's eyes, but she blinked, trying to hold them back. "You're not my revenge, Rhys," Maxwell said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You never were. You're my redemption. You're the reason I can breathe again. You're everything." He released one of her hands and held her face, his thumb caressing her cheek. "I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you see beauty in everything. I love how you make me want to be a better man. And I'm sorry, so sorry, for making you doubt that even for a second." Tears now flowed freely down Rhys's face. "Maxwell, I won't run anymore," he promised, pressing his forehead to hers. "I won't let fear decide for me anymore. I want to wake up with you every day. I want to tend these gardens by your side. I want to build a real life with you, if you'll still have me." Rhys held his face with her hands, dirty with soil and all, and pulled him into a kiss. It was salty with both their tears, but it was perfect. It was promise and forgiveness. It was pain and healing. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When they finally separated, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "I love you," Rhys whispered. "I always have. From the moment you saw me when no one else did." Maxwell wrapped her in his arms, holding her as if he would never let her go again. And there in the garden she had created with her own hands, under the sky painted in impossible colors, they embraced. The months that followed were transformative. Maxwell and Rhys didn't just become husband and wife, they became true partners. They worked side by side on the ranch, she with her innovative ideas and he with his experience. The mansion that was once cold and silent filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of meals prepared together. Rhys transformed the gardens into something spectacular, and Maxwell was proud to see her teaching the staff, to see her flourish in her own light. And then, on a golden autumn afternoon, as they walked through the fields hand in hand, Rhys stopped. "Maxwell," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He turned, worried. "What is it? Are you okay?" Rhys took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. "We're going to have a baby." Maxwell froze. His eyes widened, dropped to where his hand rested, then returned to her face. And then, for the second time since he'd met her, Maxwell Carter cried. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with so much love and gratitude that Reese felt her heart overflow. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for saving me, for giving me a reason to live again, for giving me a family." Reese smiled through her tears. "We saved each other, together." And there, under the orange sky of dusk, with the fields stretching around them and a bright future ahead, they remained, two hearts that had found their way to each other in the most unlikely places. Because sometimes love doesn't come when we expect it. It comes when we need it. And sometimes the person we save you ends up being the one who saves us too. The story of Reese and Maxwell teaches us that sometimes love is born in the most unlikely places, amid pain, betrayal, and abandonment. Reese was chosen out of revenge, but became the redemption of a man lost in his own darkness. And Maxwell, trying to hurt the one who betrayed him, ended up finding the only person capable of healing his deepest wounds. They proved that no matter how many times we've been ignored or hurt, there's still room to start over, to be seen, to love and be truly loved, because sometimes all someone needs is to be seen. And maybe deep down this story is also about us. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the Super Thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you.